Able to hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Did you just start it?
Can you hear me, Sherry?
Hear you. Can you hear me?
Yes, ma'am, we can.
We're in progress. So this will be put up on our YouTube channel after the program, but I appreciate everyone being here. So we are very pleased to have with us Dr. Merlin Tuttle. The Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation, where he is currently and solely active. Merlin also founded and led Bat Conservation International for nearly 30 years before leaving in 2009. Through Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation, he provides the world's finest bat photo gallery, the most up-to-date responses to exaggerated disease speculation, and much more. Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation is the only place to access his more than 60 years of unique experience or to support his continuing efforts. I don't know if any of you have the opportunity to hear Dr. Tuttle speak before. I know we've got some members in the audience who have heard him. He's spoken to our annual meeting previously. He's spoken to the Washington County Wildlife Society. And I will tell you from personal experience, it is a real treat to hear his expertise and to see the fabulous photographs that he has. So I'm going to go ahead and make Dr. Tuttle a presenter, and then he'll be able to put up his presentation. So Dr. Tuttle, you're now a presenter. And like to make any opening remarks, or if you'd like to go ahead and share your presentation.
Good morning, Sherry, and good morning, Texas Master Naturalists. I am a great admirer of Texas Master Naturalists. You guys do a great deal of good for our Texas wildlife, helping people appreciate its value, and I am most grateful for that work. I am going to pause a little bit here while we get set up to begin my program.
Yes, and I'm actually having a little technical difficulty on my end as well. For some reason, we are seeing.
Sherry, I'll be ready when you are.
Okay, if you'll give me just 1 second to. Okay, the virtual presentation is fine. It's our program here in the working. Don't exactly know why. Let's see if we can do this. Window. There we go. All right, we've now got you, Dr. Tuttle, and you are ready to go.
Okay. I'm so happy to be able to speak to the Texas Master Naturalist today, and I am delighted to present more than a third of the pictures you're going to see and the stories you're going to hear this morning are from just the last couple months of my work, never before seen or heard by anybody. Bats are just full of amazing surprises. They come in an incredible variety, even colorful bats like this yellow-winged bat from equatorial Africa, painted bats from Southeast Asia, northern ghost bats from Latin America. This bat was just photographed 3 weeks ago. Beautiful animal that has literally transparent wings. Snow white. It's not an albino. It would have pink eyes if it were an albino. And right here in Texas, we have spotted bats, which I think are one of the coolest animals on the planet. Bats can be, contrary to a lot of people's predisposed ideas about bats, they can be just as cute as any panda. Each has its own IQ and personality. They have social systems strikingly similar to those of higher primates. They adopt orphans. They help others in need. They've form long-term, we could call them friendship associations. They're truly amazing. And yes, there are some that are just as strange as any dinosaur. And to an echolocation expert, this would probably be the most beautiful of all the bats. The bats like this have been speculated to have navigation systems that are up to 1 billion or more times more efficient on a watt per watt, ounce per ounce basis than anything that humans have yet devised. But if you have a hard time dealing with the looks of what I'll call my dinosaur bat, we do have jolly good fellows. And again, I so often have heard people say that they might like bats if they weren't so blankety blank ugly. Well, these are the 4 most widely distributed bats of America, all found here in Texas. I don't think those are ugly, and I don't think many of you would disagree with me. Bats come in an incredible size range beyond what most people can appreciate. There are giants with almost 6-foot wingspans, tiny little bumblebee bats that literally weigh a third less than a U.S. penny. Just in the last few weeks, I took this picture of a nice little tent made by tent making bats that cut palm leaves to make them hang down and form a shelter. I got some rather curious onlookers when I was taking this picture because I was at a major hotel resort in Costa Rica, and I was like 6 feet off the beaten trail, down on the ground, staring up under these cut leaves, and people were stopping and asking me what in the world I was doing. And when I'd say, have a look for yourself, and they'd look up and see these bats, oh my God, incredible, they're cute. And that's the reality of most people who start to understand bats. The more we know about them, the less likely we are to fear them, the more likely we are to admire them greatly and appreciate them. Not all bats that make tents cut the same kind of leaves to make tents. This is the better known Honduran white bat that is widespread in Central America, particularly in Costa Rica. They cut heliconia leaves, and here you see them close up. It's hard to imagine any mammal much cuter than these little guys with their yellow ears and nose leaves and white, soft fur. Photographing bats can be a lot more difficult than most people would imagine. This picture was taken just a matter of days ago, me photographing bats in the rainforests of Costa Rica. To give you an idea of what goes into photographing these little guys, it took 2 of us hours to just find and then acclimate the bats that I'm photographing here. They were so well camouflaged that even after a local person who knew about them pointed them out, it took 20 minutes for us to actually see them well enough and understand where they were to even think about getting ready to take pictures. And then it took close to 2 hours to acclimate the bats that they weren't afraid of us. Bats are very smart and they learn pretty quick. But if you want to get close to bats to photograph them, you have to be very careful not to startle them while you're moving closer. In this case, I ended up photographing them from just 6 feet away, but to do that, I had to sit on a soggy, wet leafcutter ant nest with the soldier ants attacking me, trying to chase me away. But here's the resulting picture. this was the first time in my whole career that I'd ever seen bats cluster this way, like little shingles. I was quite impressed with them. These are chocolate colored sackwing bats, their common name, Cormora brevirostris. I took this picture just with a camera on a tripod and a single flash, but many of my pictures take a whole lot more work than that. The next day, or actually it was later the same day, I'm setting up to try to get a unique picture here. They're right in front of that ruler, 3/4 of the way to the top, just to the left of it. You'll see a little about 1.5 inch in diameter hole in a 4 inch in diameter sapling. And believe it or not, there are bats down in that. We couldn't see them well enough to know what kind they were, and I was very curious to find out. But this illustrates some of what I have to go through to get the pictures that I'm sharing with you today. We had to carry 6 tripods and flash stands, 5 flashes, camera, and an infrared beam triggering device 2 miles out into the jungle to set up for this picture. And we're not always successful. Here's what we did find that night, which we were not very happy to find. This is a click beetle that can produce quite a light. The 2 big bright lights on its head are not actually its eyes. Its eyes are located in front of those. But what happened was just before the bats were going to emerge, we started getting these kinds of images because the click beetles, I had never seen that happen before, but they were attracted to little about 1/8 inch wide red lights on my beam that would tell me when it was on and ready to be triggered. And this swarm of click beetles showed up, and they were all lit up, flying around, so that I had my camera shutter open on bulb, waiting for a bat to trigger the flashes. And this is what I was getting these bright beetles flying around, and I had to give up the whole idea of getting those bats. We actually didn't give up easily. We carried all of our equipment back yet another night, the next night, and set up once again. And that night, I had the beams set just like 3 inches in front of the hole, but apparently the bats crawled out and crawled around to the back side before they flew, so I didn't get any pictures, period, after 2 days of hiking 2 miles each day, carrying all that equipment and spending hours setting up. But the next night, I set up for a rare bat, Phoropterus horrens, that is one of the least seen bats of the New World. And I was excited to try to get a picture of one of them. We knew that they had been discovered in the area, and we just set up where we thought they would be seen flying. We didn't get one, but here's our consolation prize. Unexpectedly, this big-eared bat came flying by with a beetle in its mouth, and we got a great picture of that, so I wasn't as unhappy as I was the previous 2 nights. Sometimes we get lucky and get the perfect opportunity. Here I have a shaggy bat, Centronicter centralis, and this one was probably even less likely for me to find than the Phoropterus that was so rare. I'd never even believed that I was going to get one of these in my lifetime. But walking down one of the forest trails, we found this little guy just 20 feet above us hanging from a leaf. That's part of why this one is so hard to find and photograph, is that they just roost as individuals hanging from a leaf, one of the millions of rainforest leaves that are always overhead. And from a few feet away, they look like just a dead spot in a leaf. And so they can be very difficult to find and photograph. Now back to some of the diversity. One of my favorite bats of Latin America is the frog-eating bat. These guys learn the calls of all the frogs in the rainforest, perhaps up to 60 species, and they easily identify them by their calls and avoid those that are too big to eat, too poisonous to eat, and whatnot. And just to illustrate how much there's still to learn about bats and their sophistications, more than 90% of the world's bats have been so little studied that we barely know how to identify them as species, and maybe have an idea that they eat insects or fruit or pollinate flowers, but they're just an enormous amount yet to be discovered. I can't think of a more exciting area of research for a young person to go into than to study bats. We're still describing new species all the time. Since I began studying bats more than 60 years ago, we've gone from 800 known species to more than 1,400, and we're discovering new things about them all the time. These frog-eating bats, when I first discovered that they ate frogs in the late 70s, I was told by leading hearing physiologists that it was impossible that they could hear frog calls because no mammal could hear over such a wide range of sounds. They echolocate at about 150 kilohertz and hear frog calls down at maybe 1 or 2. And so 40 years later, there's still a whole group of scientists studying this bat, making new discoveries all the time. One of the latest discoveries is that we can actually, of course, from the very first, I knew that I could train them. I learned to train animals as a falconer when I was a teenager. And one of the first things I learned about photographing bats was how to train bats like the frog-eating bats to come on call and do various things. But it's recently been published that these bats can be trained to come on call or respond to a novel sound, be marked, released back to the wild, and recaptured years later, and they still remember to come on call. They're absolutely incredible. Now let's talk a little bit more about values of bats. This is a Corolla bat, widespread in Latin America. Just one of these little guys can carry as many as 60,000 seeds to new locations in a single night. Imagine the impact that they have on reforestation. They're the only animals that consistently spread seeds in open clearings. Birds and primates, most other animals don't like to get out into open areas because they're at too risk of predation. But at night, bats fly over and they have very rapid digestive transit times, 15 minutes sometimes. And to light, they eat up to 2 and 3 times their body weight in a night. Imagine that. And they need to lighten the load as quickly as they can. So they have these rapid digestive transit times. And as they're flying off to the next place to feed. It's actually easier to fly over the open areas than to go through the forested areas. And as they fly along, they defecate seeds. So, for example, in one study in Africa, it was found that bats accounted for 95% of the first seeds dropped in cleared areas that were abandoned by farmers. Now let's look at pollination. Many of the most valuable fruits and timber and other commodities that we rely on worldwide are heavily dependent upon bats for either seed dispersal or pollination. This short-nosed fruit bat is pollinating wild banana in Thailand, and this one is the dawn bat is pollinating durian flowers. Durian fruit sells for billions of dollars annually and is probably one of, if not the most valuable fruit in the world based on the price per unit sold. But even here we have serious problems. Here's what happens. The bat comes pollen. You see, a given tree may have hundreds or even perhaps thousands of flowers blooming on a single night. And so how do bats know which ones have already been visited so that they do an efficient job of pollination? After this bat visits and successfully pollinates a flower, the tree drops the petals and anthers, which are no longer needed. They fall to the ground. And I have consistently found that growers believe that the bats are damaging their crop. And in almost every place that I've been, farmers actually go out of their way to kill the bats that pollinate their durians because they think they're destroying crop prospects by harming the flowers, when in fact this is just the plant's unique mode of signaling to the bats which flowers have already been pollinated and where to go next. It's really sad to think how many, literally millions of bats that are so important to things like the durian industry are actually killed by people who simply misunderstand them. This is a baobab tree, one of the world's most famous trees. It grows across the East African savanna areas. Huge tree. And it's often been referred to as the African tree of life because it is so important to wildlife, providing food and shelter, and yet it is also highly dependent upon bats as its primary pollinators. If you were an engineer and God himself, you'd have a hard time coming up with a better system of pollination. The reproductive organs hang down such that when a bat comes, it has to land, when it lands on the flower, it has to do so in a manner that encases all the reproductive organs in between its wings and belly. And then it has to rotate 360 some degrees around the flower to get all the nectar. And in so doing, it has to do an absolutely superb job of moving pollen to stigma and achieving pollination. And plants like this often are not just important ecologically. This one, again, the fruits from baobab sell for $1 billion a year. And we don't have to go very far to find bats being economically important. This footage was shot in Oaxaca, Mexico, showing long-nosed bats pollinating the agave, from which all tequila and much of the mezcal is produced. Loss of these bats could prove extremely economically costly. And back to the ecological side, this is a tank plant, one of the most numerous plants of the rainforest canopy in Central and South America. These plants catch and hold water and serve as kind of drinking fountains for arboreal animals. This long spike that sticks up helps the bat find the flower at night. And here you see a bat pollinating the flower. I could spend an entire talk just telling you about the amazing sophistication of the relationships between tropical plants and bats in getting pollinated just right. This plant is putting the pollen on the bat's forehead. There are other flowers I could show you that put it on the bat's throat, put it between his shoulders, put it on his belly, or put it on his wings. Plants don't want to mix their pollen. Producing a hybrid plant by mixing pollen is kind of like breeding a horse and a donkey and you get a sterile mule. So plants have a lot of reason for specializing. Another major area of importance that bats play has to do with keeping insect populations in check. We could spend a whole hour just talking about adaptations between bats and insects. There's this constant, we'll call it warfare going on, where the insects are constantly trying to develop better ways to detect and evade bats, and bats are constantly countering with better ways to outsmart the new techniques of the insects. Many moths actually listen for bat echolocation and avoid areas where they hear bats. But the bats are very clever, and there are several kinds of bats right here in Texas that alter their echolocation to be extremely high or extremely low so that they're beyond the hearing range of the moths that are listening for bats. And the moths can't afford to change because most bats are best detected at about 40 kilohertz. So they need to be tuned for them. The bats that have very low frequency calls are invisible sonically to the moths, but they can't be very abundant or the moths would adapt to them. Bats here in Texas have a huge role to play in not just ecologically, but economically. These bats are emerging from Bracken Cave. I'm very proud of the 20-some years I spent helping acquire that site for protection. This one colony can consume more than 100 tons of insects nightly, and they often specialize in crop pests like the corn earworm moth. They can fly at speeds of up to 100 miles an hour using tailwinds. They can climb thousands of feet up in the sky to intercept migratory moths in the spring, and just one bat can catch enough of the moths to prevent them from laying enough eggs on crops to force Texas farmers to spray multiple acres. Texas Parks and Wildlife reports that bats all told in Texas are saving farmers conservatively more than $1 billion annually. And yet bats living in caves like this are very, very vulnerable. Not only are they vulnerable because people actually deliberately burn and kill bats, but also one of the biggest threats that I routinely see here in Texas is we protect an area and we think that it's a done deal once we protect an area, and so vegetation grows up around cave entrances that is unnatural, that would be killed back by periodic fires originally. Here's in this picture, I'm showing a cave that I estimate once held at least 30,000 bats as a primary roost. It's in a nature reserve, but it no longer has any bats because the vegetation was allowed to grow up around the entrance, and it's too risky for bats to try to live there anymore because of the snakes and other predators that can catch them as they have to slow down to get through the vegetation. This is a very serious problem in Texas. In one case, I know of a cave where goats were allowed to have access to the entry area, and then when Parks and Wildlife Department acquired the property and protected it in the park, the goats, of course, were excluded, and vegetation grew up around the entrance, and 1 million bats disappeared. Fortunately, we were able to figure out what the problem was soon enough to reestablish the population, but this is a very serious cause of bat loss right here at home. And worldwide, we've lost huge numbers of ancient, huge trees like this. This one was photographed along the San Marcos River, but fewer and fewer of these remain. People buy up choice real estate along the river, and first thing they do is go in with a bush hog or something and clear out lower vegetation and plant grass. They'll save a few big trees like this. They love them because they're beautiful and they provide shade. But next flood that comes along or a big storm, they either get blown down because they're no longer in any way shielded from the wind, or they get eroded and knocked down in the flood because they don't have any further protection around them. And in Texas, right in the eastern part of our state, we had at one time trees like this. This black gum tree is just one example of the kind of huge trees that existed prior to the arrival of European settlers. And some of these ancient trees were described as being so large that several men could walk in to an entry hole at the base and look up 10 or 15 feet up above them to a cluster of roosting bats. These kinds of trees are just virtually non-existent anymore. It's extremely difficult to find such habitat anymore, and bats like our big-eared bats have lost their homes in these trees, and they're now considered, they're state listed as endangered in most states, but available evidence says that they were once among the more abundant animals of Gulf region areas where we had the cypress and black gum lowland habitats. One thing that we've learned is that we can reestablish habitat, but there's no way to do it. You can't wait 100 years or 200 or 300 years to grow a big hollow tree. In the meantime, we can build what we call bat towers. Originally, we thought that a hole at the bottom of the tower was the way bats preferred, but that was because that was the only kind of place left that they could use, and they were using areas that they shouldn't have been using. We actually eventually learned that the best thing was a smaller hole up partway up the side where a raccoon couldn't sit beneath it and grab bats as they came in and out. Here's some of the big-eared bats. Colony of a couple hundred of them are in their young. These kinds of roosts work very well, but only if you build at least two of them in the same general area and have one of them designed, let's say, painted black on top, or one of them in the sun, one in the shade, anyway, so that one is cooler than the other. And once we learned to do that, we found that we could shelter a colony of these bats that would just move seasonally back and forth between the two houses. There's a huge amount left to be done to help bats like these. One of the things that I've personally done to help bats is introduce the idea of bat houses. I introduced bat houses to the United States back in about 1982. And in fact, if you don't have it, you might want to get my recently released new bat house guide that has all the latest up-to-date info on how to build bat houses and place them in the right places, attract bats. Bat houses can be really valuable. In this little house, could have been built by almost anybody. It houses a type of pipistrelle bat, and in a study conducted in the Mediterranean, researchers found that by just strategically placing these small bat houses around rice paddies, they could reduce pest damage to the extent that they didn't have to use pesticides any longer. Now, this is a very good case for preserving biodiversity. It turned out that this wouldn't have worked had they tried the same thing where there wasn't any natural habitat near enough. But these rice growing areas where they didn't have to use pesticides after attracting more bats, they were adjacent to a national park, which preserved alternative feeding habitat. You see, the bats can come eat your pests during a certain season, but then after one harvest the rice, there's nothing more for them to eat there, and they would starve to death if they didn't have other habitats to turn to find food. And saving the parkland nearby made it possible to use bats instead of pesticides to control pests. There are studies going on right now that are providing some really amazing results. In fact, Carme Corral is working in Spain on a PhD project. In fact, if you're a member of Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation, you'd have recently seen a blog about her work. She's using netting that can cover a large area to exclude bats, but allow insects to pass through. and she's comparing what happens where bats can eat the pest versus where they can't. And she's getting very impressive results. She's finding that on average, bats are saving rice farmers in Spain an average of 72 pounds of rice per acre. And that's certainly not insignificant. We're now introducing Texas farmers, particularly pecan growers, to the benefits of bat houses. Here we're holding a workshop last September down at Troy Swift's pecan orchards near San Marcos. And he was amazed to find that there are already 8 species of bats being in his orchards at night. And he got interested in use of bats for biocontrol. Here in Texas, we have some really outstanding opportunities to check and see just how much value we can get from bats because, for example, pecan growers mostly have their orchards near alternative natural habitat along river corridors. And so it's an ideal opportunity, just like in the Mediterranean study, to utilize bats to help reduce pests. Troy is not just a pecan grower, he also has a sawmill, and he utilizes only trees that have been knocked down in floods or otherwise have been lost naturally. He doesn't cut any living timber, but he says there's more than enough to supply him for the rest of his life. And he's now gotten into building the best bat houses that exist relative to the needs of Texas bats. There are plenty of other bat houses that are quality houses, and you can find out which ones are the best by looking for our certification. If they're certified by Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation, they have to meet minimum standards. And of course, Troy's are certified. Here's the 2 kinds that we helped him develop. In fact, these are the 2 kinds that more than any others we promote in my new bat house guide. These houses allow bats to survive even the extremes of Texas heat that were encountered last summer. One of his houses was first occupied by 75 bats during the week in which temperatures averaged between 102 and 109 degrees Fahrenheit. So we're pretty sure that these houses are sufficiently ventilated to handle high heat. And since then, he's testing 16 houses right now. They are all being used by bats within the first year, and some of his houses have been used all through the winter. We're very much looking forward to using genetic barcoding to identify the insect species. He's very interested in what they might be eating in the winter that might have as yet unknown impact on his orchards. If you're interested in really well-suited houses for Texas, his are made out of inch-thick cypress wood, and cypress is the 2nd longest lasting wood in America, second only to redwood. So he says that these houses, without not even being painted, will last at least 50 years. And that's a very important consideration when you're trying to help bats. You don't want to help them for just a few years and then have the house fall apart. So if you're interested in purchasing houses here in Texas, I don't think you can do better than going to him. Although there are other certified builders that we recommend. One thing that you need to look out for here in Texas is the gray rat snakes. Not just them, but a variety of predators will crawl up poles to eat bats. And once they find a easy meal, the bats at that site are pretty much doomed and will leave. That can be prevented using a predator guard, and I've described those in my new bat house guide. That this predator guard is pretty simple to make. It's commonly used to protect purple martin houses as well. Now I want to introduce you to just one example of how important bat conservation can be to human interest, looking at a whole new aspect. Some 40 years ago, I was asked by the monks at Khao Chang Prawn Cave in Thailand if I could figure out why guano production was falling precipitously at their Khao Chang Prawn Cave. They were extracting the guano for fertilizer that they sold to support the monastery. It didn't take me very long to figure out that poachers were killing huge numbers of bats by putting nets over the entrances. And so I recommended that the monks hire a game warden to stop the poaching and pointed out that the increased guano production would far more than compensate for the cost of a game warden. They hired the warden. When I came back 10 years later, guano sales had gone from 12,000 to almost 90,000 US dollars a year. Since then, illustrative of the kind of needs for ongoing oversight, these bats have started to decline again. And nobody at first had any idea why they were declining. They blamed it erroneously on pesticides. Not that pesticides don't cause problems, but this wasn't the primary problem. The primary problem, it turned out, was again brush overgrowth. I went and explained that they had overprotected the surrounding vegetation, and if they had trimmed it back, they could get their bats back. They did, and now the bats are a major tourist attraction, a major guano source for fertilizer, and they are estimated to be saving $300,000 a year in avoided crop damage. That's in a published peer-reviewed journal. They're also attracting huge numbers of tourists to enjoy watching the bats. This man here in the chartreuse shirt is so proud of his bat dolls that he's patented them, and his wife, last time I was there, showed me their patent papers. All told, these bats are now worth about $200,000 a year in guano fertilizer sales, $300,000 in prevented crop damage, and the economics of tourism hasn't yet been evaluated, but it's probably a very large additional chunk. These bats, just for one small Thai community are probably worth between $500,000 and $1 million a year. And what I'm especially proud of, we took this picture just in my most recent visit there in 2019. The school is now heavily subsidized by the extra income from saving the bats. And in recognition of that, the school principal, teachers, and all the students wear bat t-shirts 1 day a week to school. And I can't overemphasize how much fun it is to go back to a place like that and be welcomed as though I'm MacArthur coming back to the Philippines by people who are benefiting from my conservation efforts. Now I want to introduce you to our most recent conservation work. I'm just showing you a few examples. There are actually more like dozens to hundreds, but we have workshops that we hold in various places around the world where we go there specifically to help further conservation locally, train locals, help achieve things that couldn't be done otherwise without the finances that we also can bring. This is the Kasonga National Park in Zambia. And in our last trip in November, those who participated in the trip, their funds for participation were used to build this new nature and research center. And the participants went out at night and introduced the local Zambians to bats that they'd never even dreamed of seeing before. I presented a PowerPoint program to the park leadership and workers, better explain to them the importance of protecting these bats. And here we're on our way out to see one of the most spectacular events in the entire animal world. Joy, our cameraman, is about to climb up to what looks like a kid's playhouse, but it's actually a great bat viewing spot. Here he's waiting for the bats to come out. And what we're there for is to help gain protection from immediately threatened flying foxes, straw-colored flying foxes. Here they are emerging. 8 to 10 million of these bats depend on this park as a stopover site annually where they stop and feed for a couple months. Without this site, all these bats could be lost. And these bats have huge economic and ecological impact all across Africa because they migrate following the monsoon seasons across thousands of kilometers of Africa, and every night they are distributing billions and billions of seeds into clearings that need reforestation. As we have probably most of us heard, desertification for lack of forest regrowth is a major issue that causes famine and other problems in Africa. These bats have nearly 3-foot wingspans, and each bat is capable of consuming twice its body weight nightly in food. So their impact in dispersing seeds is absolutely incredible. They're also incredible just to watch. This is the dawn return as the last stragglers are coming back in at dawn. One of the things we did with funding from that trip was we contracted with a helicopter pilot and did a survey to document the major threats that are now facing the bats. We took the doors off the helicopter so we could film. One of the first things we saw was this pumping station. This is just outside the park on the river that feeds it's the primary water source for the park. And it's estimated that if illegal pumping that has already started is allowed to proceed, that it could take 90% of the park's water during the dry season, when it's especially important, and pump it out for agriculture, mean probably the end of the park, and would have impact not just there, but all across equatorial Africa. And when the park was established, part of the legislation protecting the bats stipulated that a huge area around the park had to be left in its original condition, used by the original inhabitants of the area, but not used by industrial agriculture. For example, as you see here, during the COVID period, a lot of illegal activity moved in without anybody noticing much because we were all distracted. But if this kind of vast clearing and water pumping continues, these bats are not the only things that will be doomed. There'll be huge problems for people and other wildlife all across Africa. So another thing we did while we were there was we went out to visit the local school children and educated them to be concerned about what would happen to them and their families if the bats were lost. Now, I can't resist ending on what's happened here in Texas. When I came to Texas in 1986, the only thing Texans were hearing about bats was that they were mostly rabid and would attack people, and especially were dangerous to attackers of children and pets. Today, we have more than a dozen bat viewing sites, protected viewing sites in Texas, and bats have obviously taken a huge turn for the better. This poster was what I found when I first came to Texas, and the people in Austin were signing petitions to have the bats eradicated because they had been informed falsely that they were mostly rabid and dangerous. Whatever you've heard recently about bats being extra dangerous distributors of disease, that is coming from gross exaggeration by people who have huge grants at stake that depend on scaring us sufficiently about bats. For anybody who simply doesn't handle bats, the odds of contracting any disease from a bat are extremely remote. What we've learned here in Austin is that bats can be a goldmine opportunity, both economically and for conservation. Since I convinced the city not to destroy these bats, they've become a huge tourist attraction. They bring millions of tourist dollars a summer. Not a single person in the last 30 some years that we protected these bats has been attacked or has contracted disease from the bats. And these bats consume tons of crop and yard pests each summer night. We have now become a world leader in educating people to the value of bats. And in conclusion, I want to invite each of you to join me at Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation. There is so much more urgently needed to be done that can be done but only with help. I can't do it alone. I have to have staff to help with all the many projects. We receive more than 1,000 requests for photo use annually. My photo collection is, in addition to everything else we do, is now the foundation for conservation efforts worldwide. And as you've seen, we not only have this big collection, but just in the last month, we've probably added 1,000 new pictures to it. Pictures that, you know, it's been said that a photo is worth 1,000 words. I'd say a photo is probably worth 10,000 words when it comes to bats. And we're showing the world, not just telling the world about the importance of bats. And we're making a very big difference. And I hope that each of you will want to join in supporting my efforts at Merlin Tuttle's Bat Conservation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to answering your questions, assuming we still have time for that.
Excuse me, we certainly do have time for that. And we're looking forward to getting an opportunity to ask you some questions. I'm going to kick it off by asking you a question about your own personal interests. I know that you've spent your entire career focusing on bats, but I'm really curious about what first attracted you to bats as a subject for study.
I've been interested in nature all my life. By the time I was 2 years old, I was raising monarch butterflies at home and calling the whole family to come see when I knew a pupa was about to hatch. By the time I was 5, I was terrorizing my poor mother, bringing snakes into the house that would escape. By the time I was a teenager, I was practicing falconry. And, you know, people now wonder why I don't get upset when hawks come and catch bats at Bracken Cave. But that's nature. Predators are helping us keep animal populations healthy. And because of having so many diverse interests in nature, before I ever got into bats, I have been able to see more clearly the overall needs. You know, we can't just get excited about one kind of animal that we want to protect. Bats are the most endangered mammals in America today, but we have to look out for the whole, not just individual kinds of animals. And I got interested in bats mostly because I lived near a bat cave in Tennessee when I was in high school. And I found them doing things that the books all said they didn't do. I got my mother to take me to the Smithsonian to meet with some of the authors and show them my field notes. And they were impressed enough to give me thousands of bat bands and suggest that I go back and ban the bats and see where they were going. I had evidence that they were migrating, but the book said they didn't migrate. And that's how I got started. And I've been accused of being a bit on the overkill side by people trying to keep up. But starting with that meager effort, I ended up banning 42,000 gray bats and tracking them for 20 years. And that led to my deep concern about conservation, because I found that at the time that I was doing my research on gray bats, they were predicted by leading experts on American bats that they were declining so rapidly from human deliberate killing that it was projected that they would soon become extinct. And I couldn't be prouder today of anything I've ever done, more than the fact that the gray bat, whose extinction was predicted in 1968, we now have millions more than when their extinction was predicted. There is a lot we can still do for bats, and I'm excited to be showing the way, but I won't live forever. I need to leave my legacy with my new organization and train new people to take over what I am going to leave behind.
Dr. Tuttle, if you'll go ahead and stop sharing your presentation, I think that will bring your face into the larger screen, and that will make it easier for our viewers to be able to see and hear you.
While we're waiting, I want to point out that we produce a wide variety of well-documented resources on almost anything that a master naturalist is going to be asked about. And that can be a very big help to you. For example, people will still today ask, well, aren't bats rabid? Don't I have to worry about them? My resource, Rabies in Perspective, explains all you need to know to answer people's questions. For example, we're told that most people in America that die of rabies get it from bats, but we're not told that it's so rare that it's just 1 to 2 people a year out of 300 million. And we're not adequately told about the fact that those people that do get rabies from a bat have handled bats carelessly, been bitten, and then not done anything about it. For anybody who just leaves bats alone and enjoys watching them, there's virtually zero threat of harm.
Okay, so I think what we're seeing on our screens now is your website and a lot of the resources that are available on your website. And there really is a lot of information there.
Well, we've heard so much recently about bats supposedly having more diseases than other mammals. That's based on the fact that some researchers went out and looked almost exclusively at bats. And of course, since 99% of the world's viruses are yet to be discovered, you're going to find them mostly where you look for them. And if you look for them mostly on bats, and they examined almost as many bats as all other mammals combined, and then said bats had more viruses. But subsequent published studies that are too often ignored by the news media have shown that bats don't have any more disease, don't pose any more disease risk than any other animals. And in fact, bats have one of our country's finest track records of not transmitting disease to humans.
Great. All right, folks on the line, you also can unmute yourself and ask a question if you would like to, and I'm going to open it up to the folks here in the room who would like to ask a question. So Judy, did you want to ask something?
Yes.
Could I just before we start that, point out that all these pictures you're seeing now, they're just part of the thousands on my website that are available for you to use in promoting your own programs to help people understand bats. This collection is out there for you to use. The information is for you to use, and we're very happy to help you.
Okay, Judy.
Oh, okay, Dr. Tuttle. I just wanted to ask you about cactus moths. Do bats help with it? There's been some worry about cactus moths destroying the agave and the tequila industry and all that. Can you comment in that? And also, the second question is, how important is Texas vis-a-vis the bat migration?
Your question is how important is Texas bat migration, or what they do in
Yes,
controlling insects that migrate?
passing through Texas like birds do to go up to the rest of the U.S. and Canada.
Well, let me point out that some bats, like the hoary bats, have been documented to go all the way from Canada to Mexico in the fall and back to Canada in the spring. that's not an easy thing to achieve for a nocturnal animal that roosts solitarily. But we do know that. Our free-tailed bats migrate, but not all of them. Some of them play kind of Russian roulette and hope they're not going to freeze to death by not migrating. And we found out that that could be risky 2 years ago. But our bats are flying up and intercepting migratory moths. There are billions of corn earworm and armyworm moths that migrate across Texas out of Mexico every spring, and they hopscotch north. They'll stop in Texas and produce a generation, and that one migrates, and they stop a couple states further north, and they keep doing that all summer. So our bats here in Texas, they, the bats from Bracken Cave alone are estimated to be eating somewhere between 100 and 200 tons of insects in a single night. Well, that not only can have a huge impact on Texas, but it theoretically can help protect farmers as far north as Canada.
Okay, thank you.
Do we have any other questions here in the room, Karen?
Yes, about
You want to come on up here and ask your question?
Excuse me, I didn't answer the cactus moth question. Frankly, I'm unfamiliar with the cactus moths. It would help if I knew what family they were in. Bats tend to have extra big impact on Geometridae and Noctuidae, those families. They may have a lot to do with these moths, or they may not. I have not heard of anybody doing work on these yet, but I will say this: we are currently funding a project at the University of Texas where they're looking at a year-round cycle of feeding the bats at Congress Avenue Bridge, and they're going to be identifying probably more than 100 species of insects that the bats are eating. Up until now, we haven't had the ability to tell what species of insect the bats ate, just could identify them to order. Now that we can identify them to species, for the first time, we can ask questions like, are they eating cactus moths, and are they eating any consequential numbers of them? We're beginning collaboration with entities to do similar barcoding genetic identifications of bats in pecan orchards, but this is something that could well be done looking at the moths that are involved in the cactus problem that you report. It's just that there are far too many people looking for reasons to fear bats and not nearly enough people. It's easier to scare people into studying something that like claiming that the bats are diseased than it is to raise money to document how important they are. But it's very possible that the bats are having an impact on cactus moths, but I don't know of anybody doing research on that yet.
Yes, so I would like to ask, I'm interested in animals that live in groups, and you were talking about bat behaviors. Where can I find a source for that? Learn a little bit more about bat behavior.
Uh, there isn't like one single source, because in the first place, there are more than 1,400 kinds of bats, and they have a huge range of difference in lifestyles. There are bats that go fishing every night. There are bats that pollinate certain kinds of flowers. There are all kinds of bats that have different strategies of how they survive and how they help each other. Vampire bats, for example, they're very vulnerable because if they miss finding prey for even 2 evenings in a row, they can starve to death. So they have developed a special mechanism whereby a vampire that has successfully found food can come home, and one that hasn't can communicate the need for help, and the one that did find food will regurgitate part of its meal at risk to itself in order to save its companion. And there are studies.
Feed for young, teaching young to feed.
Gary McCracken did work years ago showing that mother free-tailed bats recognize their own young. And I have seen in the caves that it's just amazing in a cave like Bracken where you have thousands of bats flying at a time, and a pup in a cluster that may be as dense as 500 in a square meter, the pup will hear its mother's voice out of all the thousands of mothers flying by and will raise up and vocalize, "Here I am," kind of mom. And she'll come back, and they only nurse their own pups. But if a mom loses her pup for some reason, let's say it falls and gets eaten by a snake or something, she will then adopt a pup that may have lost its mother. And there are well-reported incidents of bats assisting each other. One story that I find very interesting, years ago, a woman named June Took in Australia hand-reared a flying fox, released it back to the wild gradually out of her backyard, and it migrated with the other bats when it came fall, and she didn't see it for months. But then when the bats of that species of flying fox came back, one night she was in her backyard and this bat just suddenly flew down and landed on her shoulder, greeting her like a dog that has been left at home for a week and greets you when you come home. And so this bat started coming back and seeing her every night. And eventually the lady just figured out that her bat was pregnant. Well, these bats, when they give birth, they'll take their pups and take them away from their daytime roost and put them somewhere else, and then there'll be some mothers that'll babysit, protect them from predators. So when this mama bat gave birth to her pup, she started bringing it and leaving it with the woman who had hand reared her as an orphan to be her babysitter. And that's the story that was verified by multiple PhD level biologists.
Thank you, and I want to thank you for Bracken Cave. We've been, and it's amazing, so thank you.
Do we have any other questions here in the room? Come on up, Marvel. We're in a fairly good-sized room with not the greatest acoustics, so having our questioners nearer our mic is better.
Good morning. Is this okay?
Yeah, just talk to the elephant.
Okay, great. If there is a mosquito within 100 miles of me, he will find just me. So when we were writing the plan to preserve our property more for pollinators and songbirds, I had also considered doing bat houses for selfish reasons as well as conservational reasons. But it was suggested to us that to have a bat house and to bring predator or pollinating insects to the same property would be counterproductive. Do you agree with that?
I'm trying to fully understand the question. It was thought that
And
adding a bat house to a pollinator site would harm the plants that need to be pollinated because of the bats eating the pollinators. Is that the question?
Correct, the bats eating the pollinators that I'm also trying to attract.
It depends, not all bats eat the same kinds of moths, and not all moths are equally vulnerable to bats. I will have to admit that I have a hard time answering that question. People ask me a lot of other questions like, are bats going to harm bees? And the answer is no. They don't overlap that much in time of activity, but even when they do, bats don't fare any better from a bee sting than we do. But there are bats that eat sphinx moths readily, but the bats that eat sphinx moths are not found in your part of Texas. It would take knowing a whole lot more about exactly what kinds of moths you're trying to encourage and what kinds of bats might feed on them. We'd have to know more than I can have available right now to answer that question. But I seriously doubt that having a bat house in the area is going to make a significant difference in the flowers getting pollinated.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions here in the room? Anybody online who'd like to unmute themselves and ask a question is welcome to do so.
While we're talking about bats and bat houses, let me point out that a recent study in Wisconsin only looked at bats living in bat houses, and they found that they were eating 15 species of mosquitoes, and that 9 of those were carriers of West Nile virus. And they found that a species of bat, the big brown bat that we had traditionally thought ate mostly beetles, because beetles are easiest to recognize in their feces, that bat, it looks like probably up to a third of its diet is actually mosquitoes.
And for you, as you know, probably know, as Texas Master Naturalists, a big part of our mission is outreach to the community. And you gave some examples of the bats, the benefits the bats provide to us as far as eating insects, preventing crop damage, and so forth. The examples you gave today about pollination, none of those were in Texas. Are there any specific Texas-based plants or crops that are pollinated by bats that we might include in our outreach efforts?
I didn't say that the agave was in Texas because it wasn't. It was in Mexico, but there are agaves that are bat pollinated in Texas, but we don't have a lot of bat pollinated plants that we're aware of, at least. But a couple of years ago, I led a workshop out in Big Bend, and we found pollen on bats that we weren't able to identify at a time of year when we had no idea that there could be anything flowering that bats would be pollinating. So there's obviously things yet to be discovered. But the agaves only occur in small areas, mostly Big Bend area of Texas. They are highly dependent upon bat pollination, but it is a generality. We don't have a lot of bat pollinated plants in Texas.
Any other questions from here in the room? Online? Well, Dr. Tuttle, thank you so much for spending part of your Saturday morning with us. Every time I hear you speak, you have something new and inspirational to tell us. And I hope that we can make good use of what you've shared with us today for our outreach efforts for the citizens of Texas.
Well, I very much enjoyed speaking to you, and I'm always happy to help Texas Master Naturalists.
Thank you. All right, everyone, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording and end the meeting. And I thank everyone for joining us online. And we're going to continue with our meeting here.